This presentation reviews the Presbyterian Church in Canada's policy for dealing with sexual abuse and sexual harassment. We acknowledge that the denominational office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada is on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca and, most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the land's significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived, and continue to live, upon it and whose practices and spiritual ties were connected to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. And we acknowledge as we gather to talk about safety in the Church that the Church has sometimes failed to be a place of safety. We confess our failings and apologize, and we reaffirm our commitment to healing and reconciliation with Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Before taking this training, please go online to the Safety Policies page and watch the video directly above this one, labeled 30-minute online video, Sexual Misconduct, Learn to Spot It, Learn to Stop It, produced by the Anglican Church of Canada. Alternative links are on the screen. This online training module is offered as a basic introduction to our denomination's policy for dealing with sexual abuse and sexual harassment, sometimes referred to as the SASH policy. It is also intended to be a brief refresher for those who have already taken a training in the policy. We begin by setting out what we hope to accomplish in this training. That we would be able to understand and identify sexual misconduct. That we would be able to understand the Church's policy and position. That we would be able to know what to do and how to respond to inappropriate behavior or cases when they arise. That we would be able to understand some of the key concepts underlying appropriate and inappropriate behavior, for example, boundaries, consent, power, and vulnerability. That we would be able to take steps to prevent sexual misconduct in our own behavior. The training will cover the following areas: an overview of the SASH policy and its theological and legal foundations. Some key definitions, including obligations under the Criminal Code of Canada, as they pertain to the Church. A discussion of the issues of power, vulnerability, and consent. The use of the SASH policy to handle complaints. Healthy Church responses. The training will be followed by a review of knowledge participants will take to demonstrate their understanding of the material presented and to indicate they have taken the training. The SASH policy begins with our understanding that our sexuality is God's gift to us, and like all of God's gifts, it can be misused. The policy of the Presbyterian Church in Canada on sexual abuse is set in the framework of what it means to be a sexual person of Christian faith and a servant in the Church. Our sexuality, as a dimension of our whole selves, is to be offered to God. In the expression of sexual desires, we are called to holiness. God values sexuality as good, blessed, and purposeful, both as an expression of love and for the procreation of children. Sexuality is a gift to be celebrated. We are called to be responsible in the use of our sexuality, and to respect each other as human beings made in God's image. From this belief in the sacredness of our physical beings, we understand and declare that every person has the right to sexual and bodily integrity. All those who serve the Church, especially clergy, church leaders, staff and volunteers, are expected to adhere to Christian ethical principles in their sexual conduct and in their exercise of authority and power. The Church in all its extended ministries is to be seen as a safe place in the community, a place where it is known that sexual abuse is not tolerated. This is part of our Christian witness to the community. Therefore, the leadership of any group using church premises for their activities is also subject to this policy. Our commitment is to model the example of Christ, and to be rooted in the love of Christ in all our relationships. For any Christian to betray trust by the grave ethical transgression of sexually abusing another, whether child or adult, is to deny their own Christian identity, as well as to deny to the one abused the witness to the risen Christ in the world. Such a betrayal will be a gross injury to the one abused, and a violation of faithfulness to Christ. Because of the serious consequences of sexual abuse, the Church must make every effort to ensure that sexual abuse does not occur within its jurisdiction. When such abuse does occur, the Church must make a clear and just response. It is, therefore, the policy of the Presbyterian Church in Canada that sexual abuse or sexual harassment of any kind by any church leader, staff or volunteer will not be tolerated. The SASH policy embodies certain guiding principles. All complaints of sexual abuse or sexual harassment will be taken seriously. Every complaint will be received, investigated, and acted upon in accordance with the terms of this policy. The person complained against is always presumed innocent until proven guilty. If the presbytery or session cannot conclude from the evidence, on a balance of probabilities, that the actions did occur as alleged, then it must decide that the complaint cannot be substantiated. In simple terms, the person complained against will be found innocent. Any complaint must be substantiated before discipline can occur. The protection of children is a priority. In accordance with civil law, any complaint of sexual abuse of a child will be reported to the Child Protection Agency, the Children's Aid Society or its equivalent, immediately. This duty to report is a legal obligation. Any professional person in a position of trust or responsibility who has a reasonable grounds to suspect that a minor is, or may be, in need of protection from physical or sexual abuse or neglect, is required by law to report this to the appropriate provincial child protection agency. This is mandatory, and not optional. It's not up to the person with a reasonable suspicion to conduct an investigation. That will be done by the Child Protection Agency. A person who is alleging to have been sexually harassed shall be informed of the right to seek assistance of, and take their complaint to, the appropriate Provincial Human Rights Commission. This policy is the policy of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The policy governs all ministries and individuals accountable to the PCC. Because it is a policy of the Church, church courts are expected to implement this policy as it is written. In the interest of fairness and consistency, presbyteries, sessions, and other church bodies will refrain from implementing unilaterally procedures not outlined in the policy. There should be no freelancing, as there have been situations where presbyteries have improvised and departed from the policy. In one case, it involved a civil suit alleging unfair treatment, and the presbytery lost. The Church is called to implement this policy in the spirit of prayerfulness, love, affection, and humility, under the continual illumination of the Holy Spirit. Together with the theological basis, these guiding principles form the foundation for the Church's policy for dealing with sexual abuse or sexual harassment. Therefore, the policy can be understood properly only in light of them. From watching the video, Sexual Misconduct, Learn to Spot It, Learn to Stop It, you'll note that the terminology used in our SASH policy is slightly different, though the concepts are the same. In our policy, sexual abuse is equivalent to the video's term sexual assault. Sexual harassment is the same. Sexual harassment by a person in authority is equivalent to the video's term sexual exploitation. Let's look at these definitions in turn. The definitions used in the SASH policy are drawn from criminal law, labor legislation, and human rights codes, often with direct quotations using legal language. This ensures the policy meets a robust and recognized standard. We have confidence in the Church that our approach is consistent with Canadian law. Note the language in the policy: sexual abuse includes, but is not limited to, any unwanted sexual contact. Now look at the list and the definition of sexual contact, which also uses the same language: includes, but is not limited to. The list isn't exhaustive. Therefore, it won't do to say, well, what I did wasn't on the list, so it should be okay. Who decides if the sexual contact is unwanted? The recipient does. Once again, any professional person in a position of trust or responsibility who has a reasonable grounds to suspect that a minor is, or may be, in need of protection from physical or sexual abuse or neglect, is required by law to report this to the appropriate provincial child protection agency. This is not an option. Domestic violence and spousal violence are a type of sexual abuse under our policy. There's a lot in the definition of sexual harassment, so let's take a few moments to unpack it. First, note that sexual harassment involves a course of vexatious comment or conduct. This means repeated behavior, involving more than one incident. If someone makes an inappropriate and offensive remark and is called on their behavior, and they stop and don't do it again, that's not harassment. But if the same inappropriate behavior continues even after being cautioned, that is harassment. Harassment involves a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Secondly, the inappropriate behavior is known or ought reasonably to have been known. The standard used here is that of a reasonable person's judgment of the interaction. It's not purely subjective. What would a reasonable person observing the behavior conclude? If an inappropriate comment would cause a roomful of people who overheard the remark to wince or gasp, that's a pretty good indication that reasonable people would recognize it as objectively inappropriate. Thirdly, the behavior is unwelcome. Who decides if the comment or conduct is unwelcome? The recipient decides, not the person whose behavior is in question. Intent doesn't matter, only the effect matters. Examples of the kinds of inappropriate comment or conduct would be sexual jokes, sexualized comments about someone's body or clothing or appearance, personal comments about someone's love life, or inappropriate names or labels with sexual overtones. The SASH policy includes a particular kind of sexual harassment by person in authority, called sexual exploitation in the Anglican Church video. This is where someone in a position of power or authority, such as a boss, superior, professor, religious leader, or Hollywood producer, is in a position to grant or deny a benefit, such as, do this for me and the job is yours. Or to make life miserable, such as, you'll never work in this town again, which is called a reprisal. Social, economic, and organizational position matters in these cases. If there is a significant imbalance, where one person has power and authority, and the other person is vulnerable and lacking resources, there can be no meaningful consent. No always means no, but yes doesn't always mean yes. Consent cannot be meaningful in such a power imbalance. Let's take a closer look at the issues of power, vulnerability, and consent. In any interaction between two people, it's possible for there to be a significant difference between the amount of power or influence each person has. For example, consider this list of sources of power and influence. Think about the relative differences between typical ministers and typical members of the congregation when it comes to these resources. For example, consider the minister's role. Ministers, as the spiritual leaders of the congregation, have authority by virtue of their ordination, which sets them apart from members of the congregation. They have specialized training and knowledge of church traditions, processes, and procedures. In their pastoral role, ministers have privileged access to members of the congregation, especially at times when those members are in crisis and are at their most vulnerable. Other contingent factors on the list could further tip the balance of power and resources in the minister's direction, for instance, where the minister enjoys a measure of financial stability, or a social and family support network, which a member may not have. There may be instances where this balance of power and resources doesn't favor the minister over the congregation member. But they are relatively rare. For the church to believe there's meaningful mutual consent, there must be two things: choice and equality. Both parties must be equally resource-rich in the relative distribution of resources. In practice, what this means is that ministers' resources are greater, and often much greater, than members of the congregation. Without this relative equality of resources, the person in the position of power might exercise that power over the person who is less powerful and vulnerable. The person lacking in power and resources may feel pressure to give in to the person with the status, power, and resources. A minister has a duty and responsibility to care for the members of the congregation and act in their best interests. Given the relative imbalance of power and resources between ministers and members of the congregation, meaningful consent may be absent even if the member initiates the sexual activity. Recall for a moment the counseling scenario from the Anglican Church video where the counselee expressed interest in taking the relationship beyond the professional level to a personal level. In short, sexual activity without meaningful consent is an abuse of power. It is sexual abuse. Ministers are held responsible for setting and maintaining professional boundaries and limits. If this isn't done, if a minister crosses a professional boundary and violates the trust and vulnerability of a member of the congregation by engaging in sexual activity, that minister will be held responsible under the SASH policy. One important aspect of the SASH policy is preventative. It strongly encourages the church, and especially those in positions of leadership, to take proactive steps to create a healthy climate which will minimize the risk of ministerial sexual misconduct. So, what are some of these steps? Ministers, look after yourselves and take care of yourselves. Clergy self-care is important. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," the implication being that if we are unable to love and care for ourselves, we won't be able to effectively love and care for others. Take time off. Don't overwork and burn out. Maintain a healthy diet. Exercise regularly. Get enough rest and sleep. Don't neglect your spiritual life, or disregard the care and nourishment of your soul. Engage in spiritual disciplines that keep you connected to God. Develop strategies and networks for support and accountability. For instance, meet regularly with trusted colleagues to share the mutual joys and challenges of ministry. Tend and cultivate meaningful relationships with others outside the congregation. Spend time with family and friends. Develop hobbies and interests outside the church. Clergy who are experiencing isolation, feelings of loneliness, and lack of support are in a danger zone where they may be tempted to fulfill unmet needs in inappropriate ways. Set clear boundaries and keep them. Separate the personal from the professional. Provide educational opportunities for leaders and others on SASH issues. Review your various ministries and restructure them in such a way as to minimize the risk of sexual misconduct with vulnerable persons. For example, put a policy on place requiring at least 2 adults to be supervising children and youth programs. Recall the server training scenario from the Anglican video where a single adult would not be left alone with a single young person. Our denominational Leading with Care policy will assist clergy and congregations in making their buildings and programs safer. We're going to look at the sexual abuse and sexual harassment policy now. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive examination of the policy, but rather an overview of the process to be followed if there's a complaint. There are 4 procedural stages when dealing with a complaint under the SASH policy. Discovery, when the complaint is first received, and the initial actions taken. Intervention, where decisions are made about assigning pastoral care providers, advisors, and leaves of absence. Investigation, where the complainant, respondent, and witnesses, if any, are interviewed, evidence is gathered, and a report with recommendations, if any, is prepared. Adjudication, where the report is presented, a decision is made about the complaint, and if the complaint is substantiated, a decision is made about censure. Complaints under the SASH policy are received and dealt with by the court of jurisdiction where the person complained against is accountable. If the complaint is against an elder or a member of a congregation, it is handled by the session. If the complaint is against a minister, it is handled by the presbytery. There is one exception, where a minister makes a complaint against a member, adherent, or salaried staff person in the congregation served by the minister, the complaint is handled by presbytery. It's also important for the court of jurisdiction to determine the nature of the complaint. If the complaint alleges criminal behavior, for instance, involving a minor, or if criminal charges have already been laid, the church investigation stops until the criminal investigation has been concluded. Once the criminal investigation has ended, the church may resume its investigation. Suppose, for example, a member of a congregation makes a formal complaint against a minister under the SASH policy. Because ministers are under the authority of a presbytery, and accountable to the presbytery for their conduct, the member would contact the clerk of the minister's presbytery. The presbytery would deal with the member's complaint. All presbyteries are required to have a standing SASH committee of at least 4 individuals. Any complaint against a minister would be referred to this committee. The SASH committee acts as a go-between, speaking separately with the member complainant and the minister complainee. At no point is the member complainant required to meet face-to-face with the minister complainee. The member complainant will meet privately with the Presbytery SASH committee. The member will write a description of the complaint, what happened, when and where it happened, who was involved, who might have been a witness, and signs the written complaint. The complainant member doesn't have to write up the complaint themselves. The complainant member can ask someone else to write up the complaint for them, but the complainant member must sign the complaint. The Presbytery SASH committee, once it has received the written complaint, will inform the minister complainee that a formal complaint has been made against them. The SASH committee then provides resources and support for those involved. It arranges for pastoral care providers, for both the member complainant and the minister complainee. It arranges for advisors, who will provide guidance and advice on the church procedures, for both the member complainant and the minister complainee. It determines whether or not to place the minister on a paid leave of absence without prejudice, a legal term meaning with no assumption of guilt, for the duration of the investigation. In the investigation phase, the SASH committee first meets privately with the minister complainee. The committee gives the minister the member's written complaint and listens to the minister's response. The minister then writes and signs their response to the complaint. The SASH committee then meets privately with the member complainant. The committee gives the member the minister's response to the complaint, and it listens to the member's response. The SASH committee interviews any others whom it reasonably believes to have evidence or information pertinent to the complaint. The SASH committee prepares a report of its findings to Presbytery, which includes a summary of what the member complainant and the minister complainee have said, and includes a recommendation about whether or not the complaint has been substantiated. The Presbytery is then required to meet privately, also known as in camera, or with closed doors. They meet privately to receive and consider the report of the SASH committee and its recommendations. The Presbytery decides whether the complaint has been substantiated. The standard of proof used is the balance of probability. This means, once all the evidence has been considered, is it more likely or less likely that the alleged events occurred? This is the same standard used in civil lawsuits. It's a high standard of proof, but not as high as the beyond reasonable doubt standard used in criminal trials. If the Presbytery decides the complaint is not substantiated, the minister is deemed to be innocent of the allegations. If the Presbytery determines the complaint is substantiated, then it proceeds to discipline the minister by administering the appropriate level of censure depending on the severity of the minister's actions. The discipline options, or levels of censure, a presbytery may administer are as follows. 1. Admonition. If the abuse is considered isolated and relatively minor, such as a temporary lapse of judgment, then an admonition may be administered. Admonition is solemnly addressing the offender, placing the offense before them, and exhorting them to greater circumspection. See the Book of Forms, page 367. It is a verbal dressing down and is administered in private. An admonition may only be used if the accused displays remorse. The presbytery must be satisfied that the abuse will not recur to use this level of discipline. 2. Rebuke. If the abuse shows a willful flouting of ethical sexual behavior, or if the accused person shows an inadequate acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation, a rebuke may be administered. See the Book of Forms, page 368. A rebuke is similar to an admonition, only typically administered in public. The rebuke may include a temporary suspension from office without pay, or requirement to enter therapy, or any other disciplinary task designed to prevent a recurrence of the abuse. Evidence should be offered that the task has been completed to the presbytery's satisfaction. 3. Removal from office or position. If the presbytery considers the abuse has been the cause of severe damage, or will recur in the future, or if healing of professional relations is not possible, it may sever the pastoral tie, or remove the accused person from their position. The ministerial certificate shall not be released until the presbytery is satisfied that steps have been completed to prevent future abuse. Such steps may include therapy, withholding the certificate for a set period of time, spiritual direction, or any other task set by the presbytery. See the Book of Forms, pages 369 to 372. Or, 4. Deposition from ministerial office, when the offender is an ordained minister of word and sacraments, or a diaconal minister, and if the abuse is substantial, involving criminal acts, violence, abuse of minors, or repeated episodes of abuse, the abuse shall be treated as gross immorality and the offender shall be deposed from the ministerial office. See the Book of Forms, pages 373 to 373.2. If either party is not satisfied with the decision, they can ask for a formal church trial under Book of Forms pages 356 to 364. In a formal trial, the member complainant and minister complainee testify in each other's presence and can be subject to cross-examination. An important note: if a criminal charge is laid against the minister complainee, the church process stops until the criminal charge is disposed of. This concludes the training portion on the policy for dealing with sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The final exercise is an online 10-question multiple-choice review of knowledge that participants will take to demonstrate their understanding of the material presented, and to indicate they have taken the training. Please return to the Safety Policies page website under the Sexual Abuse and Harassment Training section and click on the link to review your knowledge.